Hi, Matt.
Hi, Sina.
Great. I'm glad you're able to join us.
Hello, everybody.
Good evening, everybody. As I mentioned earlier, Matt Bladowski from Dental Strategy will be discussing some slight selection criteria and a lot of the traps that doctors are falling into when they're looking at selecting a location for their dental office. So I'll hand things over to him, and he'll walk you through some of the mistakes that dentists make when choosing a practice location, and I'll talk to you about the key considerations when negotiating an offer to lease or letter of intent once you've been able to find that location.
Sounds great. Thanks, Sina. I apologize for the technical problems, but hopefully everybody can hear me well. So what we would like to talk about today is the 7 deadliest mistakes dentists make when choosing location. There are a lot of mistakes you can make, but given the amount of time we have, we're going to concentrate on the top 7. The first thing, if I could really get $1 for every time a dentist ever mentions the word that a practice would be a challenge because of saturation, I would be very, very rich. Even if I was only getting the Canadian dollars, I'd still be pretty rich. It is a competitive market, and the bigger the city, the more competitive the market. However, overall, dentists do well. And in fact, Canada is the best market in the world to be a dentist. Markets like U.S. are good markets too, but you just have to work a lot harder. And the opportunities really that the Canadian dentists will have over the next 5 to 10 years are way, way too remarkable. So why do dentists struggle? So there are a number of reasons, and some are easier to fix than others, but one of the big reasons is that right away they harm their chances to success by starting or purchasing a practice in the wrong locations, and we see it all the time. So over the next 15 minutes, we will talk about some of the most common mistakes dentists make when choosing a location. So when we say the word location, there are really 2 meanings. One of the meanings is the qualitative part, which is important, and dentists typically do well when it comes to choosing a good location from a qualitative perspective. They look at the physical space, they check out the neighborhood, the curb appeal, and make decisions on really how they feel. If they like the neighborhood, the area, and they get you Sina to negotiate a good lease, they will sign the dotted line. The problem is that very seldom that they will weigh the quantitative side of the analysis, and this leads in many cases to the wrong decisions. So for example, when you look at the 2 pictures below, if you had an option to choose between one of those options, almost all the dentists would choose the picture to the left. It's a nicer location, and people would say this is the right place to be. Very few dentists would actually choose the location on the right. And if you look sort of for the next slide here, very, very few dentists would choose a location like this. So this could actually happen if you don't have your lease reviewed by the professional. You can get a place like this. Pretty tough to having a family practice in Mr. Wiggles' neighborhood. And by the way, if something ever happens to you like this, let me know. We'll come up with some very creative ways to rebrand your practice. So don't get me wrong, the qualitative part is very important, as we can see in this example, but let's not forget the quantitative part, because setting up in the wrong location is the most expensive mistake to fix. One of the services that we offer as a company is the background research to help dentists really understanding the demographic and competitive landscape. We've analyzed over 3,000 different locations across Canada based on specific criteria, and we continue to monitor and update the information for any changes. Here's a list of some of the factors that we look at when we look at a location. So on the left, you'll see a big laundry list. There's a lot more, but here are the main ones. Some dentists will use this research to make better marketing or practice management decisions. Other dentists will use it to determine the best location for the practice or determine if a particular location is good for them, whether starting or selling a practice. They like, in particular, the fact that after doing this analysis, we can rank them. So when you see the map on the right, you see little numbers there. So we could actually look at a big area for a dentist, and based on the criteria, based on what it is that they're looking for, we can rank those locations from 1 to 100 to 1,000, however many there are. So dentists really ask me, Matt, well, this is all great, but we found this beautiful place that we love. Is it really worth it to do that extra research? Well, I'm sure we all know a dentist who might not be as good, might not have such a good practice. Their marketing might not be good or might be inexistent, but they're still doing well. Well, the difference between an average and great location can amount to 10 to 15 patients a month. So what does it mean to the bottom line? Well, let's just look at a very simple example. Let's assume that the difference between having an amazing location and having an okay location is not 10 to 15 patients. Let's assume that by having a better location, you're going to get one extra patient a month. That's all, one patient. So one patient equates to 12 patients a year. And if you have a practice for 25 years, you're looking at 300 patients over the lifetime of the practice. Consider that a patient will spend on average $3,000 over the lifetime with a practice. This brings an extra revenue of $900,000, just one patient a month. Now, if your patients happen to refer, we all know how important the referral is, and we'll just assume that each of those patients, only one of those 5 patients in their lifetime will refer a family member or friend. And then out of those, just 1 out of 5 at some point will refer somebody. We're looking at a number of 10,500 patients, which brings us to a revenue of $43 million. So anywhere between $1 million and $40 million is what you could expect an extra of revenue based on one extra patient a month. So as we can see, it does make a difference to have a good location. So we know a great location brings money, and since moving a practice is expensive, the wrong location is the most expensive mistake to fix. So let's look at 7 of the most deadly mistakes that dentists make when choosing a location. Number 7, understanding the competition. So dentists will often make a decision on whether or not they should open a practice in a specific location based on the competition. However, what they define as competition is the dentist on the next corner or the dentist 2 blocks down. The problem is that dentists are not convenience stores, meaning that patients are willing to travel between 3 to 5 kilometers to see a dentist. So if a patient's living 5 kilometers away from your practice and is willing to travel after 5 kilometers to see a dentist, this patient's also willing to travel 5 kilometers the other way. That means that the competition is not the dentist across the street or the next corner, but the dentist that is 6 to 10 kilometers from your chosen location. So if you're exploring a location within a big city, you will need to look at 50 to 80 dental practices as your potential competitors, and not just the 3 or 4 that are closest to your location. So if you only look at the 3 to 4 practices, you're looking at maybe 8 to 10% of the competition. Number 6, backward marketing. We work with a lot of dentists helping them make strategic and marketing decisions based on the demographics. And I can tell you a lot of times the dentists are just in the wrong locations. And it doesn't matter what you're going to do from a marketing perspective. You're never going to get the result that another dentist will that is in a better location. So the problem that dentists make is we call it backwards marketing. So what most dentists will do is first choose a location that they like, set up a practice, and then they think how they will market it. This seems rational, but actually it's totally backwards. What successful businesses do is exactly the opposite. So first, the dentist should ask him or herself the type of practice they would like to have, the type of procedures that they would like to perform and refer out, whether or not they're willing to work long hours, accept assignment, etc. Based on the practice and their individual strengths, the dentist should decide then on their target market, meaning the patient who is most likely to choose their practice and least likely to leave. Then they should determine which geographic areas have the greatest amount of patients who will fit those characteristics, and then choose a location that will give the dentist the greatest exposure to these type of patients. That's why when you ask me, Matt, where is a good location to set up a practice? I need to answer. Well, it really depends on you. When we work with dentists, we go through a long question to determine the characteristics that will make a good location for the dentist. Because some of the one geographic location could be really good for one dentist, and the same location will not be a good location for the other. Number 5, stereotypes. We love stereotypes. Individuals have many different options. Individuals can choose where they can go, but they're often held back by the stereotypes. Just like all stereotypes, there's an element of truth to them, but a lot of them just aren't accurate. The reason why we like them is, thanks to them, these stereotypes help our clients find good locations in areas that other dentists consider unattractive or too competitive. Some of the most common stereotypes: dentists in this particular area don't charge copay. Or this is an area where everybody asks for discounts. Or if you're in this particular area, you have to speak Chinese, Hindi, whatever language. Or this is a typical assignment market. But the biggest stereotype of all is that I can't be in a big city. In order for me to be successful, I have to be 1 hour, 2 hours out of the big city. That is the biggest stereotype that is hurting a lot of dentists. While there are a lot of factors to consider that make a location attractive, we have to remember that a lot of those practices are actually frozen in time. When you look at those practices, they that are in the city, some of those dentists, they haven't really done anything over the last 10 to 15 years. They're not really looking for new patients. They're just cruising along till retirement. The staff isn't really going above and beyond to make the patient experience better. Something like that, it's very attractive for a newcomer to come in, set up a practice in between these type of practices and do very well. On the other hand, you can have practices that are an hour, 2 hours away from the big city. That's where everybody thinks they should go. But what happens in those areas? You have a lot of dentists that are like you, if you're a dentist starting a practice. They're young, they're energetic, they've associated for a few years, they're willing to take chances, they're going out there taking every C course that's out there, they're aggressive in marketing, they're working hard, they're willing to work long hours, and they have really nice practices because they're all brand new. When we look at a patient, same idea. When you look in the city, a lot of those patients are older, they've already paid off their homes, they have a lot of dental needs. When you look at some of those areas, an hour, 2 hours from the city, you have a lot of younger families. They move in, they don't have high disposable income. At the same time, they don't really have high dental needs because they're still young. And because they're the new generation, they've been taking good care of their teeth. Moving on to number 4, income. A lot of dentists will tell me, I've done my research, I know these are the places that have high income. Well, income is actually a very poor indicator of patient spending. A much better indicator is disposable income, which actually calculates the amount of people, it calculates the amount of money people have left over after all of their expenses. So you have the disposable income, and then we have something called disposable income after Maslow's basic needs. So here we know that the patients will first spend money on their food and shelter, and if there's left over, then they're going to spend on other things, such as dentistry. So this indicator actually tells us how much money people could potentially dedicate to dentistry if they made some sacrifices on their discretionary purchases. So these dentists set up in areas that are where there's virtually no disposable income. So dentists can do the best marketing. We've seen some really great marketing done. Dentists that spend $150,000 a year in marketing and have trouble attracting patients simply because they don't have this disposable income. They come in for emergencies, and then they don't come back until the next emergency. Other indicators we also look at is affordability index, where we look at their income and housing costs, and we can actually look at their spending among different procedures. So remember how we said that some locations can be very attractive to one dentist and not so attractive to another one? Well, some geographic areas, patients are looking for more ortho procedures, while others are graded for implants, others are graded for dentures, and others for preventive procedures. Really, we need to know what it is that we're looking for in order to find the location that has those characteristics. Number 3, the subdivision trap. This is something we get a lot of dentists, this is a trap a lot of dentists actually fall into. So many dentists will tell me, this is a great location for a new practice because there's a subdivision being built in the area. So let's look at some numbers. Let's assume there's a large development of 500 new homes. Well, this means potentially 1,100 new people will be moving into the area. So first we need to know where these people are moving from. If they're not moving from far enough from the old place of residence, they will not likely require a new dentist. Statistically, 85% of people don't move far enough to need a new dentist. So people who need a new dentist, the number becomes 165. Let's consider 30% of those people don't go to dentists regularly, so the market becomes 115 people. Let's then take all the difficult patients that we don't want to see. Let's take maybe some of the little children who really don't generate significant revenue. And if you don't like dentures, let's take the ones that, the elderly patients who need dentures. So we're left with roughly 87 patients. Then you have 20 other dentists who are competing for these patients, so your share actually becomes 4 patients. So even if you do very well and get 5 times more patients than the guy next to you, you're really only looking at 20 new patients. So the problem is a lot of dentists will essentially make $1 million decision, believing there's a huge market, while in reality, we're only looking at a handful of patients. Number 2, the curb appeal. So dentists will often drive around and observe the quality of homes and the types of cars on the street, and based on their observations, they'll make a judgment as to whether or not this is the location that is suitable for them. So this is great for the qualitative part of the analysis that we spoke about before. However, not considering the quantitative side of the analysis is very misleading. Often people can't afford the houses they live in, nor the cars they can drive. So there's actually a study in the U.S. Saying that there's 3 times more millionaires living in homes under $300,000 than over $1 million. So millionaires don't really necessarily live in $1 million homes. So the dentists are often fooled. So those chain link fences with a Honda Civic in the driveway are often better markets than those $2 million with Teslas and Porsches. So next time you see the well-dressed gentleman pulling in a new Tesla with the newest cell phone and the $1,000 shoes, asking to have his insurance bill directly, he might really not have the money. And one, last but not least, falling in love with the wrong location too soon. This is by far the greatest mistake that dentists make. They fall in love with a location that they consider to be perfect. But love can be blind, not only in relationships with other people, it can actually be blind in relationships with locations. And I do break a lot of hearts because people will come up to me and tell me this is a great location. But often it's not. And it's really, really hard for them to say no. So really, probably one of the highest values that I add is, I'm not emotionally attached to your location. And I will tell you this is a bad location. And sometimes dentists will still go ahead with the location. Sometimes dentists will make a rational decision and go to a better location. So that's about it for my 7 deadly location mistakes. There's definitely more locations. Um, there's a lot more mistakes that the dentists make. If someone's interested, I have another presentation that's called Top 12 Mistakes Dentists Make When Choosing a Location. And I'm actually working on the top 15 list. So since it is very costly to move a practice, choosing a location is the most expensive mistake to fix. So do your qualitative and quantitative research before deciding a location. I will pass it over to Sina now to talk about another area that is important, and if not done right at the beginning, can turn to be a very expensive mistake to fix. And as a final note, a great location with a terrible lease is not worth pursuing. Sina?
Thank you, Matt. And it's a nice segue into what I'll be discussing, which is some of the common traps that dentists fall into when they're negotiating an offer for a space once they've identified that ideal location. So hopefully all of you have taken away the importance of understanding some of the common stereotypes that exist with regards to selecting locations, and I'm assuming that you'll have some research done prior to setting your eyes on a particular site. And so once you've identified the site, it's very important that you go through the proper steps in negotiating an offer to lease or a letter of intent for that location. And the reason why this is very important is, unfortunately today, over 83% of dentists in North America that do have an office lease, these are doctors that have already signed lease agreements for a specific location, have lease agreements that are so restrictive that if the landlord wanted to, they could prevent the doctor from ever selling their practice. Approximately 20% of doctors each year that are in a lease agreement as tenants lose their ability to sell a practice because of what's written in the lease. About 75% of doctors in North America also have an office lease that can prevent them from reaching the end of their career in their current location. So if you do a lot of research on demographics, if you do select the right location, it's important that you secure that location through a long-term lease agreement. Otherwise, you may be in a situation where you've signed a 5-year lease with no renewal option or a 10-year lease with no renewal option, and you're put in the position of having to go around and search for another location despite having only been in your current location for a very limited period of time. So we'll discuss some of the strategies for getting a long-term lease agreement and why it's important to actually negotiate a long-term lease once you've identified that site. For those of you that are not familiar with Cirrus, we are a partner of Dental Strategy, and we work very closely with Matt Bladowski's team to provide our clients with demographic insights. And we were founded by dentists for dentists over 20 years ago. We've negotiated over 10,000 lease agreements across North America since our inception. And on an annual basis, we end up analyzing over 1,000 dental office leases. We have negotiated more than 50% of the lease agreements that have been sent to us. Not every doctor that contacts us that has a lease that is coming up for renewal or is interested in a particular location will actually go ahead with that location. In fact, we're proud to say that a lot of the work we've done over the last 22 years has prevented doctors from making those million-dollar mistakes by selecting the wrong location. We also deliver over 150 continuing education seminars all throughout North America. Some of you may have actually attended one of our in-person seminars in the past. So the most widely recognized conference that's coming up is the California Dental Association Conference, which is happening in San Francisco, and we'll actually be there. So for any of you are from California, I know there's doctors all across 50 states joining the webinar today, but if you happen to be there, feel free to come up to us and we'll address any questions you have. And we also work with dentists all across Canada. So once you've selected a location for your practice and you've gone through the due diligence process, now you have the need to secure that site. And what generally happens when you have identified a location is you will either be presented with a letter of intent or offer to lease. This is a document that is provided by either the landlord, or you can submit one to the landlord for consideration. And this document outlines some of the key business and financial terms of the transaction. So some of you may be working with a broker, others may decide to find the location by yourselves. If you do find a location and you have an offer to lease or letter of intent, the most important thing to determine is whether or not that document is binding or non-binding. The majority of the offer to lease documents that we see are binding in nature, whereas letters of intent are generally non-binding. Now, if you are dealing with a broker, it's important to realize that it is critical that you have a second set of eyes review the offer to lease or letter of intent, because the way the broker is getting compensated is through the landlord. And they're not acting as your legal counsel or your legal advisor, nor are they very familiar with some of the legal traps that are set in the office lease agreement. They can certainly point you in the right direction with regards to rental rates and the amount of term you should be agreeing to, and whether or not perhaps the landlord is willing to provide you with a tenant improvement allowance or a fixturing period or a free rent period. But when it comes to the finer details of these documents, it is very important that you have a second set of eyes look at the documents to ensure you're getting a fair deal. Now, there's some common elements to negotiating an offer on a space. The first one is term. It goes without saying that doctors today are not willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars without having some predictability in the location that they choose. And as such, we generally recommend to our clients a 10-year term with 2 or 3 options to renew the lease agreement for periods of 5 years each, therefore giving the client the ability to stay in the location and have some predictability with regards to what the rent is going to be for the next 20 to 25 years of their career. And in fact, most of our clients now that are 50-plus years of age, their number one concern is being able to transfer the lease agreement that they have to a future owner of the clinic. So another reason why term is important is when you retire, you want to have enough runway left on your lease agreement to pass that baton over to the buyer of your clinic and ensure that the buyer also has security in the location. After negotiating term and options, the second most important thing when you're negotiating a lease agreement is a fair and affordable financial structure. So what I mean by that is, how much are you paying in base rent, and what is your proportionate share of the operating expenses for the property? Now, for those of you that have signed lease agreements or are perhaps being presented with a lease agreement, chances are that the type of lease agreement your landlord is asking you to sign is a triple net lease, where you are paying a base rental rate, and your lease agreement makes you responsible for paying all the real estate taxes and your proportionate share of the building insurance and the maintenance costs associated with operating the building. It's very important when you're negotiating an offer for a space to identify whether or not the common area maintenance or the taxes, maintenance, and insurance part of your rent is laid out. Is it an estimate? Is it going to be capped? What is the limitations that are placed, and how much the landlord can pass the expenses that they incur onto you as a tenant? So what I generally find is most doctors that are starting up a practice, whether it's their first practice or their second or third office, pay a lot of attention to the base rental rate, but when it comes to looking at the language in the offer to lease or the lease agreement, which discusses what their responsibilities are as far as real estate taxes, insurance, and maintenance, oftentimes they don't have a clear sense of what their responsibilities are and what the landlord is going to pay for. And if the HVAC unit breaks down or if the windows need replacement, there's misconceptions with regards to, or misunderstandings with regards to who's going to take care of that. Another important component when you're thinking about starting up a practice is the time period it takes for you to build out the clinic. So if you're going to agree to a 10-year lease, it is important that the landlord provides you with sufficient amount of time to build out the clinic, because you don't want to start having to pay rent on the space immediately. When you take the keys and you have your contractors go through the space and you've already got your design plan in place, it will take several months for you to build out the clinic. And as such, the landlord should provide you with a reasonable fixturing period, which allows you to build out or construct your leasehold improvements within the premises. And that fixturing period typically occurs prior to the commencement date of the lease agreement. And during that fixturing period, the tenant generally does not pay the base rent, and in many cases they don't even pay the additional rent, meaning the cost for utilities. And this is an incentive for you to open up your practice in a particular building. in addition to the fixturing period, the landlord should also ideally provide you what is called a free rent period. And the free rent period is the time period that kicks in after the fixturing period, where the landlord says, I understand you're a dentist and it's going to take you some time, and most often it's 2 years before a dental practice will break even. It's going to take you some time to get up and running. And because you're willing to sign a long-term lease agreement, the landlord should provide you with a rent-free period that allows you to occupy the premises after constructing your leasehold improvements without having to pay any rent. And this time period could span anywhere from 30 days to 6 months. It really depends on how much demand there is for the property. If you select a prime location and there's 4 other competing offers on the space, then you can't have the expectation that the landlord will agree to, say, 12 months of free rent. So knowing the amount of demand there is for a space is a good indicator of how much you should ask the landlord when you're requesting a free rent period. In addition to that, doctors today, one of the common traps they're making is they're going to the landlord and without first negotiating the base rental rate, they're communicating to the landlord that they want the landlord to contribute to the build-out of the practice, meaning they want a tenant improvement allowance, which will go towards improving the premises for a dental office. And if you speak with any landlords or their listing agents, most often they're very keen on providing you with a tenant improvement allowance. And if they provide you with a tenant improvement allowance of $50 a square foot, you can rest assured that they will get that $50 a square foot back from you through higher rental rates for the balance of the remaining term. So when you're requesting a tenant improvement allowance, it's important to do that after you negotiate the base rental rate and get that base rental rate as low as possible. That way, if the landlord comes back to you after having quoted you a $14 a square foot rental rate and increased the value to $16, you know what the net impact is of that tenant improvement allowance if you choose to accept it. And for many of you, it would be cheaper for you to go to the bank and obtain that money from the bank and your financial institution who's willing to provide you with attractive financing rates versus getting that money from the landlord and paying a higher rental rate. Now, I should mention that some landlords, given the fact that they're very keen on doing a dental deal, will actually provide you with a reasonable tenant improvement allowance, and they'll go so far as providing a more attractive package for you that will allow you to open up your clinic in their location versus a building across the street. So it is also a function of how much the landlord wants a dentist in their building. If there's a pharmacy, if there's a medical practice in the building, the landlord may see a lot of synergy and may be willing to spend money out of pocket up front to induce you to take on the space. Now, to Matt's point earlier with regards to co-tenants, you want to control who becomes your co-tenant. Now, there's only so much control you have as a general dentist or a specialist with regards to which types of tenants the landlord chooses to add to the tenant mix. But the most important thing to recognize when you're a dentist starting a practice is you need to ensure that there's ideally some limited competition. And as Matt mentioned, most doctors today that are thinking about competition, they're looking at a block north or south, east and west of their dental office. They don't have a wide parameter and view on what is the potential competition, because as you may be well aware, a lot of patients today are driving 3-4 miles to get to a dental office. So from that perspective, the only thing you can control is what happens in your building. If you're a general dentist and you're planning on starting up a practice and you foresee that 3 years from now, 10% of your production is going to be associated with Invisalign, you'd probably want some control or say in whether or not an orthodontist moves into your building and obtains exclusivity from the landlord for their procedures and comes to you 3 weeks later and demands that you refer all your patients to them. So exclusivity when you're doing an offer to lease or a letter of intent is very important because it allows you to have some control over whether or not the landlord is able to lease another unit within the building to a competing dentist. Another component of negotiating an offer to lease or letter of intent is ensuring that you're not obligating yourself personally to the deal long term. What I mean by that is, obviously, if you're incorporating a practice today, your obligation to pay the rental rate is directly impacting your cash flow, right? If you're signing a 10-year lease agreement today and you sign it under the name of your corporation is liable to paying that rental rate. Unless there's an early termination right, you cannot get out of the lease agreement unless the landlord's been in default. So because of that, landlords are requesting doctors to not only sign leases under the name of their corporation, they're also asking for what's called a personal guarantee. So this means that the landlord doesn't care whether or not you're incorporated. What they're saying is, by signing this lease agreement, you personally are going to ensure that you pay the rent for the next 10 years, regardless of whether or not your practice is successful. Even if your production is 30% below the national average, that's not an excuse as to why you're not going to be able to pay me the rent that I'm asking for as laid out in the lease agreement. So too many doctors that we work with, when they come to us with an offer to lease in hand, we notice that they paid no attention to whether or not the landlord has asked for a personal guarantee. And when there are personal guarantees, they've agreed to providing the landlord with a personal guarantee for the entire duration of their lease term. So if it's a 10-year lease, they've basically stated in the offer to lease that the dentist will back up the rental payments personally for the entire duration of time. We have doctors today that are 60-plus years old that still have personal guarantees on lease agreements. So the key with personal guarantees is to recognize that it is reasonable for the landlord to request them, primarily because you're looking to start a new practice. There's no history behind your corporation. But if you're going to provide the landlord with a personal guarantee, you should provide a limited, ideally, guarantee to the landlord that limits your liability, maybe to the first 4 or 5 years of the lease term, and also doesn't have maximum exposure, meaning there's a limitation on how much the landlord could seek in the event that you are in default of the agreement, and that personal guarantee kicks into effect. Now, I do want to spend some time discussing what generally happens after you submit an offer to lease or letter of intent. So the offer to lease or letter of intent, as I mentioned, is the starting point for negotiating a deal on a space. Once you have identified a location and you negotiate an offer to lease or letter of intent, it is generally stated in the offer to lease or letter of intent that the landlord will be required to provide you with a copy of their standard form of lease within a certain number of days after the letter of intent or offer to lease is signed. When you obtain that lease agreement, it is important to go through that document to make sure that the terms that you have negotiated at the offer stage are properly incorporated into the standard form lease. Now, it may not surprise some of you to know that when there are negative attributes of a lease agreement, what the landlord does is the landlord does not present those at the offer stage. And a great example of such a provision or attribute is the relocation clause in a dental office lease. If there is a relocation clause to be inserted into the deal, the landlord most likely will not mention it at the offer stage, because you can imagine that if you knew that you were spending $450,000 building at your clinic and the landlord said to you at the first instance of the conversation you have requesting information on the location that there will be a relocation clause in your lease agreement, you would probably not want to engage in submitting an offer. So when you obtain the standard form lease agreement, you need to go through it, and don't assume that the clauses in the standard form lease agreement are the same as the letter of intent or offer to lease. In fact, you'll notice that the lease agreement, generally speaking, is a lot lengthier than the offer to lease or letter of intent. So if the offer is 5 pages long or 2 pages long, the lease agreement may be 4 times the volume of the offer to lease. And that's because the purpose of the lease agreement is to expand upon the key business terms mentioned in the offer, but also go into great detail with regards to additional obligations of the landlord and the tenant. And in this case, the example you see on your screen is a relocation clause that we find in many standard form lease agreements. And this relocation clause states that the landlord has the right and ability to relocate the tenant to a new premises as long as that premises is substantially the same in size. And I'm working with a doctor in Southern California right now. He came to us because his landlord has asked him to move to a fourth floor. He's on a ground floor. The landlord has asked him to move to the fourth floor of this medical building. And the space that he's in right now is close to 1,400 square feet. The unit that's available on the fourth floor that's been vacant for 4 months is almost twice the amount of space that he has right now. And he has no need, by the way, for that additional space. The landlord has lost a tenant on the fourth floor and is basically requesting that the doctor move to that location so they can free up the ground floor unit for another tenant who wants that space and is willing to pay more rent for that location. So identifying provisions like this in the lease agreement are very important. And once you identify those provisions, it's important to negotiate them with the landlord. Now, if we're to take a 3,000-foot view of why it's important to negotiate a lease agreement and why it's so critical to pay attention to these clauses, we'll realize how the lease agreement factors into the overall value of your practice. When you've identified an ideal location for your dental office and you've negotiated a lease agreement, the lease agreement will become part of the value of your practice. Because when you sell a dental office, for those of you that are thinking about even buying a practice, realize that aside from the equipment and the goodwill component of your dental office, what you're purchasing is stability. If the seller does not have a long-term lease agreement in place, or if that lease agreement identifies a very, very high rental rate, then it doesn't become an attractive purchase opportunity. And so the reason why we need to spend a lot of time up front negotiating the lease agreement is to ensure that when we're ready to sell the practice, we don't have to jump through hoops and hurdles to get the lease agreement properly negotiated. It's already been negotiated right the first time, and it allows for a more seamless transition. Now, there are dozens upon dozens of other provisions within a dental office lease agreement. Once you get past the offer stage and you obtain a copy of the standard form lease agreement, you want to read it from cover to cover, and you want to look for some of these clauses. Insurance clause, surrender provisions, liquidation, overholding. If you have personal guarantees, typically the standard form lease agreement will identify in greater detail what type of guarantee you have. And there will be a section in the lease agreement discussing things like compliance, termination rights, inspection and repair, and the submission of financial statements to the landlord. If the landlord has the right to ask for financial statements from your practice, it will discuss how often the landlord can request those statements and whether or not it's reasonable for the landlord to know things like what is the gross production of your practice. So I would recommend having somebody look through the lease agreement who's qualified in identifying these provisions and walk you through the provisions and what they mean and how they impact your dental office and your future investment in the space. And when I speak with doctors, I find that there's really two options that they have had historically with regards to having their lease agreement reviewed or negotiated. The first group of representatives who work with doctors are brokers or realtors. And these individuals are competent individuals that will help you identify a location. Hopefully you're working with somebody who's done dental office lease site selection work in the past. They're not somebody who's new to the industry and has never helped other doctors find a space for their practice. But when you work with these individuals, realize that they are in essence space finders. So you will have a need, if you're signing an offer to lease or a standard form lease agreement, you will still have a need to work with a lawyer or somebody who understands from a legal standpoint the impact that the provisions of the offer to lease have on your dental office and your investment. And so the second group of representatives and advisors are attorneys. These are individuals that went to law school. They may be able to help you incorporate. They may negotiate employment agreements or draft such agreements. They may draft purchase and sale agreements. And maybe 5% of their practice is focused on negotiating dental office leases. More than 75% of the lease agreements that dentists send to us that have already been signed have been reviewed by an attorney. That attorney could have been a family friend. It could be somebody who helped the doctor incorporate their practice when they started the business. And when we review such documents, we're often shocked to find out how much the attorney or the lawyer who negotiated the lease agreement overlooked some of the critical provisions in the lease that specifically affect a dental office, right? If you're an insurance company or you're a retail business and you happen to sell clothing, to relocate your business to another unit in the property is not a 6-month-long project. But when you're a dental office and you've spent over $150 a square foot plumbing out your dental office, the last thing you want to receive in the mail is a letter from the landlord that says you have 30 days to relocate to another unit within the property. So from that perspective, we generally find that the attorneys who are advising doctors, they're having the best intent when they're reviewing the lease agreement. Their intent is to point out things that may be problematic, but unfortunately, because they don't have enough experience getting involved with situations where the doctor is forced to relocate, or maybe their building is getting demolished and they're forced to move and look for another location, because of the lack of interaction or experience they have, specifically with dentists in these situations, when they're reviewing the lease agreement, they look at the lease agreement like they would any other small business lease. They're looking at the lease agreement and saying, would another small business owner sign such a lease agreement? And you and I both know that the needs of a dentist are very, very specialized, and the importance of these provisions in terms of rank order are a lot higher on the list. A relocation clause would probably be one of the top 3 provisions that a dentist would pay attention to when they're reviewing a lease agreement. Yet for another small business owner, that could fall to number 9 or 10 on their top 10 list. So realizing this, what we decided to do back in the 1990s is combine the traditional expertise of real estate brokers with that of attorneys and provide doctors with an advisory service which allows them to not only understand, am I getting a fair deal with respect to rental rates, but am I also getting a fair lease agreement that provides me with enough security and limits my liability as a practice owner. Now, because we are limited to 60 minutes for today's webinar, I do want to leave some time for questions and answers. So if at this point in time anybody has questions, I'm going to pull up the Q&A window shortly. You'll have the ability to type in your questions. We're not going to be taking questions through the audio input because of the number of attendees that are on this webinar. But if any of you have any questions, you're more than welcome to contact me. And for the first 5 attendees that reach out to me tonight, we will provide you with a complimentary dental office lease review and practice site selection strategy session with Matt. And because of limited resources, we're only going to offer this to the first 5 attendees that reach out to me. And if anybody has particular questions with regards to today's presentation, now is your time to ask those questions. And Matt and I will take your questions, and as many of them as possible. And if we don't get to your questions, we'll follow up with you individually to make sure you have the answers that you need. And in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, we do have a number of different resources, including a guide to starting up a dental office. So you're welcome to download those guides. If there's any additional information that you need, for example, if you are looking for comparative information on rental rates, feel free to reach out to me and I'll provide you with that information. And I do have, there's a question, by the way, coming in from one of the attendees. I'll wait for that. But I do have a question for you, Matt. When doctors are contacting Dental Strategy and they're debating between 2 or 3 locations, you touched on this a little bit earlier on in the webinar, but what services do you offer these doctors which would allow them to determine out of the 2 or 3 locations that they have in mind, which one they should negotiate an offer on?
So in that case, we use something called a comparative analysis, which is essentially we'll run the same analysis for 3 different locations. So we start with a questionnaire that allows us to really understand what it is that the dentist is looking for. We ask questions such as their lifestyle, the type of procedures they provide, the type of services they like to refer out, their vision over the next 5 to 10 years, when are they looking to sell, even specific questions, are they willing to accept assignment, how do they feel about marketing and going out into the field and getting to know patients in the neighborhood. So all this information we bring in, and based on this information we develop a rating system. And then what we do is for those locations, we compare those 3 locations based on the rating criteria that has been developed. Mm-hmm. And then at the end they can compare based on what I'm looking for. This would be the best location. This would be number 2. This would be clearly number 3.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent. Yeah, I was curious to know about that. And I had a question here. Thank you for that, Matt. The doctor's asking, what about when you want to buy the property for the dental practice? Great question. Do you offer any services to review the purchase agreement? And the answer to that is if you have a purchase agreement for a property you're interested in acquiring, by all means you can send that to us. We don't broker the purchase of real estate for doctors today. That being said, we can help you determine the pros and cons of purchasing versus leasing. And many of our clients, I should mention, many of our clients do own the property where their practice is located, and we have helped them make that decision. So whether or not it makes sense to purchase or lease this space depends on a number of factors, but we do have an assessment that we provide our clients which helps them understand which is better. And for those of you that have the documents regarding the building purchase, you can send that to us. We'll look at the documentation. We'll also have a look at what the asking price is and determine whether or not it makes sense given your circumstances. And I should mention, though, that the doctors that we work with that own their property, they decided to own the property at the later stages of their career. And the reason for that is very simple. When you go to the bank, whether it's Bank of America, Wells Fargo, or frankly you go to any of the major 5 Canadian banks, when you're obtaining a practice loan, the way that loan is structured is different than a commercial real estate loan. And most doctors that are starting a practice today are starting the practice with debt. They already have student debt or other forms of debt. Perhaps they have a mortgage. So the question you want to ask yourself is, if I'm a 34-year-old associate and I'm about to go through the journey of building out my practice, and I've never run a dental office in my life, do I want to put all my eggs in one basket? Do I want to take out a loan for $650,000 from the bank to start up a practice? Am I also looking at acquiring the building, and is it cost effective? Am I going to be in debt for another $2 million? So those are the types of questions you have to ask yourself, and the answer is it depends for each doctor, right? What may make sense for a doctor with regards to starting a practice and building a location may not make sense for another dentist given their financial situation. And I have a question here from another doctor which I'll address. If the landlord is a charity, so I assume this organization obviously is not a private corporation, they're a charity or nonprofit, they don't care to negotiate, what can you do? Interesting question, and what I will say is that you are dealing with a unique situation, because oftentimes if you're dealing with a landlord who is running a not-for-profit business or is a charity, whether it's a church, whether it's a community advocacy group, when you're dealing with these organizations, their decision-making criteria is often very different because they're not necessarily holding on to that property to drive up rental rates per se or maximize the value of the building. Maybe you're dealing with an organization that needs to have access to a particular community, and as such, the location they have is very strategic. So to answer this question, I would need a little bit more information from you, doctor. If you want to maybe email me or give me a call, we can ask you a number of more specific questions to get at the answer. But in a nutshell, what I will say is that you need to first identify why this charity is not interested in negotiating. Perhaps it's because they're looking at selling the building. Maybe they're looking at other options. Maybe they're not interested in holding on to the property, or perhaps they need to have the location. They want flexibility, and the reason why they're not negotiating your lease agreement is because they need to have the ability to expand into your space. There's a doctor I was working with in New York City where they have a non-profit foundation in their building, and that foundation has already indicated to them that when their lease agreement expires in 2.5 years from now, they will not be renewing their lease. They will be taking over the space because they just got a government grant which will allow them to hire more staff. So it looks like there's no more questions. And as I mentioned, if anybody has an interest in having their offer to lease or lease documents reviewed, if you have selected a location already and are in the midst of negotiating the lease agreement, or simply need some advice with regards to practice site selection, both Matt and I would be happy to follow up with you individually. And we're looking forward to hosting more of these webinars in the future because we notice that there is an educational gap with regards to the type of information doctors are looking for when they're building a practice. It's often the most riskiest part of their career because of the cash outlay. So the decision to choose the right location is a critical one. And I will say that I've had my clients work with Matt in the past and his team at Dental Strategy, and the work that they have done up front has saved our clients, the doctors that we work with, a ton of headache, and that due diligence has been so instrumental. I can't tell you how many times we've had doctors reconsider or reevaluate a site based on the decisions that Matt has outlined. And the perspective of Dental Strategy has been very unique for us because we generally find that doctors are so fixated on some of the common elements of selecting a location, and it's important to step back and understand how some of the most successful retailers in the industry select locations, and a lot of what they do certainly applies to building at a dental clinic.
Just on that note, I also wanted to add one thing that sometimes dentists are afraid to ask us because, again, they fell in love with this one location, and whatever we'll tell them won't change their decision. So what I tell them is, well, sometimes we can get into conversation on how can we make this a better location. So sometimes it's after they've worked with Sina and worked with Cirrus, they've already negotiate their lease or are in the midst of negotiating and ask, well, Matt, is it too late to do this analysis? I tell them, well, no, we can still do the analysis. And sometimes what we'll do is, if it turns out to be a really bad location, we see, well, how are we going to make this to a better location? So what we do is we look at the characteristics of the locations, and then we analyze it backwards, meaning we'll go back to the dentist and say, well, we could make this a better location. However, now you do need to accept assignment, or now you do have to work Saturdays, and you do have to work evenings, and you will need to hire an associate that speaks a particular language, or hire a reception that speaks this language. And either you or associate you're going to bring on needs to be able to provide implants or dentures or whatever the characteristics are. And with that, the dentist can still go ahead with this location and still do okay. So, for those dentists that might be in that situation and feel that they've already lost the battle, there's still things we can do.
Yeah, that's a great point, Matt. I mean, there's a lot that you guys do to help, I think, the doctor once they've already committed to the location. And the alignment of the marketing strategy with the location strategy is so critical to the success of any dental office. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. This webinar was recorded, and we look forward to providing you with a link to the recording once it becomes available in the next 3 to 5 business days.
Thank you.